This is one of the earliest surviving photographs of Seattle. It was taken in 1857, just 6 years after the city was settled. Not only does that mean the city is extremely young, but this photo can show us what the original Seattle looked like. The settlers altered the landscape in some visibly obvious ways, like the tree line that no longer hugs the edge of the settlement, and some not so obvious ways, like the topography of the land. David Williams took me to the spot where this photo was taken, Pioneer Square. He's a geologist and author of the book Too High and Too Steep.
So this is really the only place Seattle could have really begun, is it right where we are.
Looking at a modern map of Seattle, you can see Pioneer Square is right on the edge of these two conflicting grids. And the closer I look at this spot, the more I feel like I understand the city of Seattle. Seattle is one of the most northwestern cities in the United States. The city lies on the edge of a harbor, what is known as the Puget Sound. Sandwiched between Elliott Bay and Lake Washington, it's one of the few cities settled on an isthmus. The geological landscape made it both a strategically valuable and logistically difficult location for a city. But that didn't stop the settlers from trying.
The Denny party arrives in November of 1851. They actually settle at a spot called Alki Point or Alki Point, and they realized it wasn't a good spot because it was out in the sound, so it was getting hit by wind, and it wasn't deep water. And so they paddle in, and to the north it was all bluffs rising out of the water. And by the time they get here, the bluffs have sloped down, and this spot was the perfect spot because it was deep water, and it was one of the few flat spots around.
On today's map, there's much more flat land south of here, where the two major sports stadiums sit. But none of that existed when the Denny party got here.
So that's why Seattle starts exactly at this location. Yeah, I bike and light rail, but yeah, I've been biking here all my life. And I, of course, didn't realize as a kid that it was generally easier going north-south than east-west because of the glacial topography creating this series of ridges. Basically think of a rake creating furrows. That's what the Seattle landscape's like. So if you go east-west, you go up, down, north-south, you're sort of on a ridge or sort of in a valley.
I'm walking toward the waterfront, so I'm walking west, and boy, can I feel the hills in the streets here. I didn't realize how hilly Seattle was. Maybe that's ignorant of me, but I guess I just assumed it was kind of flat. It is not. It kind of reminds me of San Francisco a lot. I don't know what beef I'm walking into there, but I like it here. And the weather here is so awesome. It's like, it's August right now, and it is, let's see, 64 degrees. It's August right now and 64 degrees. Nature apparently grew tired before she finished Seattle. She made a wonderful harbor, produced an empire of timber, made a pass through the mountains that was a natural avenue of ingress, hung picture windows on the horizons, gave her a climate that blended with her physical charms, and then left the town site itself like a tussled, unmade bed. The settlers of Seattle were determined to make this landscape suitable for the settlement they wanted, and it wasn't easy.
If the landscape is flat, it is artificial. Because of the glacial story of Seattle carving the landscape, it's basically a landscape of hills and valleys and ravines.
But obviously the story of Seattle doesn't begin with the settlers that arrived there. There were people there before.
And I believe they had a word for the settlers. They called them the changers because they were here to change everything. I doubt that was a compliment.
Jerry is the second expert I talked to for this video.
First of all, Daniel, thanks for joining us. This is really exciting for us. My name is Jerry Hayner, and I'm one of the owners of Beneath the Streets. We are the newer of the two underground tours operating in Seattle's historic Pioneer Square.
Yes, we are underground, but we'll come back to that later. An indigenous population had lived here with the landscape for so long. So why come here and start changing everything? Why come here to start a city at all? You're not going to believe this, but I have a map for this. This map gives us the first hint why. It shows the land claims of Seattle in 1874. After the US and Great Britain had a little tiff in 1812, they decided to peacefully come together and jointly steal a bunch of native land. For decades, they co-occupied the Oregon Territory, but just 5 years before the settlers arrived, they divided it at the 49th parallel, giving everything to the south of that line to the United States. The U.S. was dividing its newly claimed land and incentivizing, quote, any white male citizen of the United States or any white male immigrant who declared their intention to become a citizen to move to a free plot of land and turn it to something valuable. Some of the wealthiest people in the world at that time had made their money selling land in fledgling cities. It wasn't until after the settlers arrived that they signed a treaty with the indigenous population called the Treaty of Point Elliott. For this video, I tried to connect with someone from a local tribe in that area, but wasn't able to. But on the Duwamish tribe website, it explains the Treaty of Point Elliott guaranteed hunting and fishing rights and reservations to all tribes represented by native signers. The main signatory on behalf of the indigenous population was Chief Seattle, which is where the city gets its name. And their site says promises made by the United States government to the Duwamish over 169 years ago have never been honored. This is a man and a group of people that felt that the earth does not belong to man, but man belongs to the earth. But the settlers moved forward and continued to create the Seattle that we now know, including this broken grid. When I'm making these videos, I have to be acutely aware that history is told by the victors. That's much easier when you're talking about something that's already happened hundreds of years ago and we can see the results of how everything's gone down. When it's happening in the present, when there are current events going on and people are saying opposing things, it can be very difficult to know what's true. And that's why I'm so grateful for today's sponsor, Ground News. Ground News is a tool I use that helps me to be a more responsible and more informed consumer of the news. They pull from over 50,000 sources around the world, and all of this is being backed up by 3 independent news monitoring organizations. They gave me the code ground.news/Daniel Steiner to give you guys 40% off their Vantage plan. One of my favorite tools from Ground News is their blind spot tool, which allows you to see what is not being reported on the opposite side of the political spectrum. They do this with about 20 stories every single day, so you can really get the full spectrum of what's going on. To show you how this works, let's look at this article. It says, SpaceX a week away from first private spacewalk. You can see how many articles were written on the left, how many were written in the center, and how many were written on the right. If you're here with me on this channel, you're gonna probably agree with me that it's always good to be informed and that there's nuance behind things. Here in the US, we got a big election coming up. It's more important now than ever to understand where your news is coming from. So go to ground.news/Daniel Steiner to get 40% off their Vantage plan, which is the plan that I use to get access to all of their features. One of the best ways you can support this channel is by using the link at the top of the description. I am a big fan of Ground News. I love what they're doing, and it's awesome that they are sponsoring this video. So thank you, Ground News. Let's get back to the video about Seattle. You can see on this map the names of the different land claims. And there's 3 of these people that I want to introduce you to so that we can understand this current grid layout that we have. First is Arthur A. Denny. He was the expedition leader for the first group that arrived in 1851 to Seattle. He was a devout Methodist, and he was a believer and upholder of the temperance movement, meaning not drinking any alcohol. The year after Denny's party arrived, David Swinson Maynard showed up, who goes by Doc Maynard because he's a physician from Cleveland, Ohio.
And he'd been there 20 years and watched it grow. He learned how to build a city, and he would later use what he learned watching Cleveland grow to build Seattle. In fact, he even chose this site based on its resemblance to Cleveland.
Unlike the sober-minded Denny, Maynard was a drunk. Not totally sure if that's the reason, but it could explain why he wears his glasses on his forehead. But to his credit, he might have been the only person to really sympathize with the native people. He was good friends with Chief Seattle, and it led him to earn the pejorative nickname at the time, Indian Lover, which I think in retrospect is kind of sick. And last but not least, we got Henry Yesler. He was born in Maryland to unmarried parents, which made him a bastard, technically. And William Spidell, a Seattle historian, explained, Henry not only was born to the title, he worked at earning it day after day and year after year with a greater degree of success over a longer period of time than anybody else. If that's any indication of the kind of man that Yesler was. But regardless of their differences, they all had one thing in common. They came to Seattle to make some money. This broken part of the grid echoes how the land was divided. In May of 1853, Denny and Maynard got together and drew up the first plats of the city of Seattle. Denny would take the northern plat and Maynard would take the southern plat. They both at the time were not amazing parcels of land. Denny's land was steep and Maynard's land was mostly underwater. This 1878 map is fun to look at because you can see the water on Maynard's land and the hills on Denny's. And where Front Street is here along the waterfront, that is now First Avenue.
This was the first survey of the city, and they said, okay, Doc Maynard, you're surveying this side. Arthur Denny, you're surveying that side. They both set out to survey. They come together. The streets don't line up. Denny accuses Maynard, who was known to drink a little bit, of being drunk when he did his survey. But Maynard was absolutely right when he did it. North, south, east, west.
But Denny wanted his plat to be oriented along the natural shoreline. So his now rests at 49 degrees off axis from Maynard's plot.
Denny was absolutely right when he did it, following the topography and the shoreline. And you have this kink in the city right here.
And this is where Henry Yesler makes his entrance. When Yesler wanted a piece of land to build a sawmill, it was easy for Maynard to give up some of his own land to do that because he knew that investing in a sawmill for the city would bring property value to his own property.
The greatest lesson Maynard picked up watching Cleveland grow was to build a city early on, you needed businesses. And the best way to get a business to choose your city is to offer them an incentive. So Maynard was offering the land in his original land claim for less than anyone else. So most of the new businesses coming to Seattle ended up located in his part of the downtown.
On this map, you can see the strange shape of Yesler's claim, but there's a good reason for it. The narrow part of his land mostly connects Yesler's Landing, a wharf on Lake Washington, to the sawmill on the edge of Elliott's Bay. This allowed him to drag the timber down this road directly to the mill. Over time, this became known as Yesler Way, and it really is the connecting line between Maynard's plat and Denny's plat. This is actually a picture of Yesler's home, and that's his wife on the porch there. And to the right, you can see the beginnings of Yesler Way. This road actually ended up having a big impact on not just Seattle, but on the country.
Loggers would cut down trees on the hill, and they would skid them down Mill Street to the mill. So everyone called Mill Street the skid road.
If you recall that Maynard was a drunk while Denny was a religious, sober man, it would start to make sense that Maynard would allow businesses to open on his plot of land that Denny wouldn't allow to be opened on his plot of land.
Wherever you had all the mill workers and loggers, that's where you built the saloons and the gambling parlors and those other grown-up businesses. And so those saloons and dance halls and gambling parlors were the skid row.
I was familiar with Skid Row in LA, but it turns out that cities all across the US have areas they refer to as Skid Row. And these are often areas that are associated with poverty and homelessness.
But it was Seattle Skid Row that became famous because of the Alaska gold rush.
In the late 1800s, gold was found in Canada. The Yukon Gold Rush brought tens of thousands of people through Seattle, and many of them had money they were ready to spend. The neighborhood became notorious in newspapers all across the country, and other cities began to adapt the term Skid Row for their neighborhoods that were similar. You can see that First Avenue has this bend where Pioneer Square is today. This bend hasn't always existed. The main route the public had to take was a straight line to Yesler and then two sharp turns to get back onto First Avenue on Maynard's plat. This is because Yesler owned this land and was unwilling to give it up. This was the main connection between the two parts of the city, and making these turns with a horse and carriage was incredibly difficult and created a huge bottleneck. After weaseling his way out of a lawsuit, Yesler finally sold the land back to the city at a very high price, further pushing the city that had made him rich closer to bankruptcy, and living up to his title of bastard. If you're standing at that point in the road today and you look down, you can look up at Pioneer Square and see where the old curb would have ran.
But it's interesting, of all the streets in downtown Seattle, 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th, only one of them goes straight through.
But this one was actually done decades later, known as the 2nd Avenue extension. For the first 30 years, Seattle was kind of crushing it. They were growing really fast, and the dreams of these early settlers were being realized. But to join the ranks of many other great American cities, it had to be initiated. June 6th, 1889 was Seattle's unlucky inauguration day into the club of cities that have burnt to the ground. So David took me right here, where that fire began.
This is the newspaper from when the fire started. A guy named John Back, who was later described in the newspaper as a thick-set blonde of mediocre intelligence, was in a building on this corner right behind you, mixing a pot of hot glue. It was a wood shop. The glue starts to bubble over, and Back acts very quickly and very incorrectly, throws water on it. You can imagine hot glue in an area with lots of wood shavings and sawdust. That catches on fire, and the Seattle's Great Fire starts on this corner. The winds come out of the north, as they often do, so the winds blow the fire to the south and burns the city down.
Even though the fire spread really quickly and burned down 25 city blocks, only one person died.
And if you look up here, you can see the pot of glue. A model of the pot, an artistic interpretation of the pot of hot glue. And then John Back disappeared.
It just skipped town?
Yeah, no one knows what happened to him. He just disappears. No one's been able to trace him after 2 weeks in Seattle, and then he's poof. What else is new?
And although this was very destructive, it did start a new chapter in Seattle's development. Reconstruction of the city started so fast that people were basically building the next building while they were putting out the fire still. In this picture, you can see tents that are set up so that merchants can continue to sell their goods. Buildings started construction while the rubble of their neighboring buildings were still standing. A lot of projects were implemented to regrade or level out parts of the city.
You need taxes in order to pay for this project. You need commerce in order to generate the taxes. So it made sense economically as well. You get the city back into business, you get people making money again, and then you can pay for the improvements.
But there is a very peculiar characteristic of the streets around Pioneer Square, where Jerry gives his tours. And this part starts to get kind of crazy. So listen close to what David said to me out front the Pioneer Building where we first started. There's something over here you want to show me?
Yeah, oh yeah. Oh, and someone's opening the gate. How exciting. There's a central little piece of the story of Seattle that is etched in rock here. So it says city datum, elevation 18.79. And right down here is this little square carved in the ground. And this is the 0 point of Seattle. And this spot is 18.79 feet above sea level. Interestingly, the original datum point was about a block south of here, and its elevation was 8.89 feet or something to that effect, about 10 feet lower, because this whole landscape around here was raised up.
And the merchants were so eager to rebuild, they didn't wait. The buildings were built first at the original street level, which was too low, and the city filled in the streets around the buildings. This might be hard to believe, it was the easiest way to do it.
This part is easy to understand, but difficult for me to draw. So be patient with me here. If you're looking at a cross section of a street, let's say this is a tall building here. You have the sidewalk here, curb, the street here, another curb, sidewalk, tall building. So what they decided to do is build a retaining wall on each side of the street that came to the height of the second story of the buildings. This is the second story. There's a reason I do videos and I don't draw. Then they filled in the space between those retaining walls with dirt. Then over the old sidewalks, they built new sidewalks that connected to the level of the new street here. And this left spaces on either side of the old street where the sidewalk used to be that is now underground.
And then the new sidewalk connected the new street level with the second floor of the building, turning the first floor into a basement and turning the second floor into a first floor. It just so happens we're downstairs outside the building on the original first floor. The building is to my right. You can see the door and window ways. On my left is First Avenue, but First Avenue has been elevated.
But why did they do this? Why go through all this effort?
If you got a pick and a shovel and you dug through this cement, it wouldn't be far before you hit the water table at the highest tides of the year. So the big problem in our neighborhood was drainage. So in order to create a sewer system that worked properly, they needed to regrade the neighborhood. Yeah, if you have to use the bathroom though, this is a good time. Just make sure you wash your hands in that sink when you're done.
Much of the land came from just up the hill, which helped to reduce its grade. So these switchbacks you can see here weren't needed. Now today around the Pioneer Square area, there are a bunch of these empty spaces under the sidewalks. And there's still a little bit of a hint you can see when walking on them.
They knew these lower levels would remain open to the public. So as they built the new sidewalks, they put in stairs. And they also included skylights.
So underneath us is an empty space, and these lights were put in to illuminate the space underneath before there was electricity.
Now where we are, they're hard to notice. They look like patches in the ceiling, but they were glass tile set into a cast iron grate. So you walked over the cast iron and the sun shined through the glass into these lower levels. We're left with a roughly 20 square block historic district.
And this wasn't the only regrade. A bunch of the land was altered after the fire.
The mound that used to be there is still there. It's just been filled in around from the topography as the city has sort of grown literally up in terms of population, but also physically raised itself up in this lowland area.
But there was another major motivation for regrading the city. This chart shows the difference in cost for just slight grade changes. The steeper the hill, the more horsepower it takes, the more it costs. So it's clear to see why the settlers would want to level out these areas.
Many cities regrade their streets. They take a street that sort of roller coasters along and smooths it out. But what Seattle did, what's different, is what I call capital R regrade. And that is this idea of literally removing a hill from the landscape and putting it someplace else. So probably the most famous is known as the Denny regrade.
You can see the hill with Denny's Hotel on top, which is now totally gone.
And this was done over 5 different projects from 1897 to 1930, removing about 11.5 million cubic yards of material, much of which, interestingly enough, ends up in the waterway unused for any purpose, but basically lowers the hill 100 feet and flattens it completely.
Another reason for the Denny regrade was to let trains through, because previously the best route for the trains was right along the waterfront. You can see on this map that they built these railroads on trestles across the water. And these really began to stack up along the waterfront.
Even though this looks like it's solid land, these are actually individual trestles that have just been connected. So these people walking across, they periodically, if they fell through this, they would drop into the water, and people periodically dropped into the water. They decide that that area underneath the railroads, which is tidal, water flows under the railroads, water flows out. That area gets used by rats. The only cases of bubonic plague in Seattle are found along the waterfront under the trestles, and they decide that's problematic. So they build a seawall and add material under the trestles and fill it in. So all of this area again that we are standing on is artificial land.
And there's still remnants of this on today's map. David pointed out the angle of the piers coming off the shoreline. You would think that the pier is at a 90-degree angle from the shore, but these are not.
Because when the railroad came along and the rail cars had to turn to access these piers, or wharfs as they were, it was much easier if they took a 120-degree turn instead of a 90-degree turn. So they're all sort of at a weird angle there. They actually run due east-west as opposed to the road, which runs northwest-southeast.
You can still see a lot of these old train routes. Alaskan Way, for example, that runs right along the waterfront, used to be known as Railroad Avenue. This later became home to a double-decker freeway that was replaced by a tunnel in 2019.
That's because we're concerned seismically. We understand the geology, that elevated roadway had the potential to be like the Embarcadero in San Francisco in an earthquake and just flatten on itself. So we removed it and tunneled because geologically it's a lot safer.
This was done for safety, but also to reconnect the city to its waterfront, even if it is an artificial one.
Seattle developed just at this time when all of this was possible, and with a group of people who were ambitious enough to want to do this. And that combination, we've been doing it forever. We always are trying to alter landscape and create a landscape that fits what works for us. I mean, that's how people are. It's been going on since day one.
I post these videos ad-free on my Patreon, which is linked below. It's right next to the link for David Williams' book, Too High, Too Steep, so you can get yourself a copy, and Jerry's tour Beneath the Streets. If you like this video, please subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, and I'll see you in another video super soon. Peace.